All right, here we go with Chapter 12, Year of Decision. Lincoln's decision to run for a second term as president seemed courageous to some, outrageous to others. Not for 36 years had a sitting president sought re-election to the White House, and no leader anywhere in the world had ever placed his name before the voters in the midst of a civil war. Some Americans feared and others hoped that Lincoln would cancel the election altogether and simply announce he would stay in power as long as the rebellion continued. How, after all, could a country at war with itself conduct a peaceful presidential election? That's a good question. But Lincoln would have none of it. He considered the election a necessity. As he explained it, we cannot have free government without elections, and if the rebellion could force us to forego or postpone a national election, it might fairly claim to have already conquered and ruined us. Win or lose, he would take his case to the people of the Union and ask for a vote of confidence. But Lincoln's path to victory in 1864 proved rocky. Early in the year, his Secretary of the Treasury, Salmon P. Chase, tried hard to interest fellow Republicans in the idea of dumping Lincoln and nominating someone else for president, namely Chase himself. Lincoln exposed the scheme, and Chase was embarrassed enough to resign from the cabinet, his hopes dashed. Disgruntled Republicans turned next to General Ulysses S. Grant. Thinking him far more popular than the president, they pressured him to challenge Lincoln, but Grant refused to be disloyal to his commander-in-chief. Later, Lincoln faced yet another challenge from one of his generals, John C. Fremont. 8 years earlier, Fremont had been the very first Republican ever to run for president. He lost that election, and he had achieved little on the battlefield since. As a Union general in the West, however, Fremont had, in 1861, tried to free all the slaves within the area he commanded. Lincoln insisted that as commander-in-chief, only he had the power to emancipate slaves as a military measure. He asked Fremont to revoke his order. When the general balked, Lincoln directly ordered him to cancel his proclamation, and the general had no choice but to obey. The controversy cost Lincoln some early support among liberal Republicans who thought that he had been too slow to act against slavery. Now, when Chase dropped out of the race for the Republican nomination, Fremont emerged as an independent third-party alternative to Lincoln. If 4 candidates could run for office in 1860, his supporters reasoned, then perhaps 3 could run in 1864. By then, of course, the president had issued the Emancipation Proclamation. Again, that is the document that freed the slaves. Yet some anti-slavery Republicans still considered Fremont a more reliable anti-slavery man. Besides, even though his military record was undistinguished, meaning nothing special, the general had once been a greatly admired explorer and, as a millionaire, could afford to finance his own campaign. More important, the likelihood loomed that a Democratic successor would proclaim that Union soldiers need no longer free enslaved people wherever they encountered them in the Confederacy. To take the slavery issue directly to the president, the Democrats nominated former General George B. McClellan, whose Antietam victory in 1862 had allowed Lincoln to issue the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation in the first place. Preliminary means the one kind of before the real one, the first one, the one that wasn't quite right. McClellan himself had fiercely opposed emancipation and had made his feelings known to the president. Now he would run on a peace platform calling on North and South to stop fighting, whatever that might mean to enslaved African Americans. In the end, Lincoln proved too deft a politician for all the enemies in his own party. When a group of liberal Republicans called a convention of their own and nominated Fremont, Lincoln calmly offered to dismiss his loyal Postmaster General, Montgomery Blair. A pro-Union Marylander, Blair had been an important ally of Lincoln's throughout the years of the war, but liberals disliked him, believing he did not care enough about emancipation. When Blair left the president's cabinet, the third-party Fremont candidacy collapsed, and Republicans had little choice but to unite around their president. As early as March, 2 Republican congressmen predicted that Lincoln would defeat Democrats and slave kings alike. By the time Republicans gathered for their own convention at Baltimore in June, Lincoln had no more opponents from within his own party, and he was nominated. To widen the appeal to voters, the Republicans renamed themselves the National Union Party. But then its leaders made a fateful mistake. The man serving as vice president, Hannibal Hamlin, was an anti-slavery man from Maine. He had seemed the ideal choice for the second spot back in 1860 when Lincoln was a little-known Westerner. Hamlin was a prominent Easterner and provided a perfect balance for the ticket. In 1864, however, East and West no longer seemed to matter, so the newly named Union Party looked to a Southerner, a Union man from the South who opposed the rebellion, to balance the new slate. It chose the only Southern U.S. senator who had refused to join the Confederacy after his state seceded, Andrew Johnson, now serving as military governor of Tennessee. Johnson did believe passionately in the Union, though he hailed from a slave state and was no friend of the African Americans. He had also come to accept the fact that slavery was headed for extinction. It is still not known for sure whether Lincoln himself or Republican politicians acting on their own at Baltimore substituted Johnson for Hamlin. In those days, such decisions were usually left to delegates at the convention. Lincoln did not even travel to Baltimore to attend the event himself, but whoever thought Johnson would make a good vice presidential nominee committed a terrible error. Johnson may have provided the desired regional balance to the 1864 ticket, but he lacked Lincoln's humanity and was not in any sense prepared to be president himself. As it turned out, he would later have to take over the job anyway. Dun, dun, dun. Of equal importance, the 1864 Union Convention also adopted a party platform setting forth its core beliefs for the future. Platforms were very serious business in the 19th century, and Lincoln very much wanted the new party platform to do something no other declaration of party principles had ever done before: pledge to abolish slavery everywhere. The only way to achieve full freedom was to amend the U.S. Constitution, an extremely difficult process. First, 2/3 of all U.S. senators and 2/3 of all U.S. representatives would have to vote yes. Then, 3/4 of each of the state legislatures had to approve the amendment. The process could be frustrating and time-consuming. Nonetheless, Lincoln took pains to make his wishes known to the delegates gathered at Baltimore. He wanted freedom to be utter and complete, and only a constitutional amendment could make his wishes utterly and completely legal. The idea seemed logical enough. The Emancipation Proclamation had declared the government to be opposed to slavery and had successfully begun the process of freeing slaves. But further action was clearly needed in the states that were exempted from the presidential order of January 1st, 1863, meaning border states like Kentucky, Missouri, and Delaware, where anti-slavery remained legal. Lincoln had other reasons to desire passage of a constitutional amendment. Although his proclamation carefully declared slaves in the Confederacy to be then and thenceforward free, Lincoln knew that this order had yet to be reviewed by the Supreme Court, and Roger B. Taney, who had authored the hateful Dred Scott decision back in 1857, was still serving as Chief Justice at the incredibly advanced age of 87. To some, it seemed Taney might live forever and, if he got the chance, would surely rule to overturn emancipation. In fact, the ancient justice had already composed the draft of a decision that held Lincoln's proclamation unconstitutional, and a case had not even come before the court. All right, we'll stop there for today.